Panoptica, Cisco's cloud application security solution, provides end-to-end lifecycle protection for cloud-native application environments. It empowers organizations to safeguard their APIs, serverless functions, containers, and Kubernetes environments. Panoptica ensures comprehensive cloud security, compliance, and monitoring at scale, offering deep visibility, contextual risk assessments, and actionable remediation insights for all your cloud assets. Powered by graph-based technology, Panoptica's attack path engine prioritizes and offers dynamic remediation for vulnerable attack vectors, helping security teams quickly identify and remediate potential risks across cloud infrastructures. Panoptica utilizes advanced attack path analysis, root cause analysis, and dynamic remediation techniques to reveal potential risks from an attacker's point of view. Visit panoptica.app to learn more today. That's panoptica.app.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody is doing well. Another weekend perspective. We are right here at the end of June 2024, the midpoint of the year, the middle of the year. We've all made it halfway through 2024. Hope everybody is doing well. Last week, I talked a little bit about, as we look at, 10 years of the CNCF, essentially, the 10-year anniversary of Kubernetes and 10 years of the CNCF. Really kind of looking at, with all of the new open source projects that have evolved over the last decade, how many of them were successful and what were some of the assumptions that they made in terms of, are they projects and technologies that were relevant to an individual person? Are they projects and technologies that required multiple teams to work together? Are they projects that required people to acquire a whole new set of skills that were sort of way outside of their normal domain? This week, I really want to talk about the other big topic that comes up all the time when we talk about the CNCF and we talk about cloud native, and that's open source. And, when we talk about the CNCF oftentimes, and we talk about the projects and the growth of open source and so forth, on one hand, we can talk about kind of the success of open source, right? Open source is one in terms of it's, the place where a lot of innovation is happening, a lot of interesting things have happened. It's a place where we see communities coming together and creating things. But at the same time, we also do the natural thing that we do in our tech industry, which is sort of scoreboard, right? We keep track of, quote unquote, winners and losers, or at least who's been successful and who hasn't been successful. Again, we'll talk a little about how we measure success. But I really want to talk today a little bit about, how do we look at open source projects from the context, from the lens of, are they turned into successful technologies, things that become sustainable over time, but more importantly, do they become part of, ecosystems, companies, ecosystems, marketplaces that are financially sustainable, profitability sustainable. And, I know there'll be different opinions on you should never measure open source in terms of profits and revenues and all those sort of things. But the reality is, technology costs money, and in many cases, technology costs money somewhere along the stack, whether it's hardware or software or people's time or whatever it might be. And I want to kind of dig in, not to kind of pick winners and losers per se, but to really kind of look at what are the characteristics of the open source projects that have led to profitable markets, profitable companies, if you will, but profitable markets where multiple companies participate, multiple ecosystems participate, and kind of look at what those characteristics are in the context of, as we look at the next 3 years, 5 years, maybe 7 years, as new things come along, do they have the characteristic of something that, has a way of becoming profitable and sustainable, so that if you are a business looking at the technology, you understand where the options are in terms of somebody supporting you or its long-term sort of health versus things that you're going to take on and own and operate and have to maintain yourself. So I want to dive into that right after the break. Welcome back to the Cloudcast. I'm your host, Brian Gracely, and on today's Weekend Perspective, as I mentioned at the top of the show, top of the hour, we are going to dive into sort of identifying what successful open source projects look like, and I'm going to kind of clarify successful there, because obviously that's probably the most important word in the title and the focus of this show is, there are thousands of widely used open source projects, from Linux to Java to MySQL to Docker to Kubernetes to MongoDB to hundreds and hundreds in between in, kind of every domain from, infrastructure project, technologies to database technologies, programming languages, and then, just a whole series of things that people use on a day-to-day basis. They may not even know is open source. They may just know it's some free thing they downloaded off the internet. So the concept of open source over the last 25, 30 years, 35 years, however long it's been really since since the Linux kernel came out and the whole idea of kind of free and open software came out, has been tremendously successful in terms of bringing innovation to market, allowing people to collaborate when they want to bring new ideas to market, when they're frustrated with things that are closed and proprietary. It's allowed ideas to be shared. It's allowed, it's brought the cost of computing down. In fact, the internet as we know it today probably doesn't exist without, some of the things like lower cost hardware, x86 hardware, lower cost x86 hardware, ARM hardware, but open source software, things like Linux and lots of other things. So I think as a whole, there's really no argument that open source has been tremendously successful at helping to bring ideas to market, to help reduce cost of software and technology, to allow people to collaborate freely across geographic boundaries, across companies, across all sorts of things, right? So for the most part, you could argue, hey, open source doesn't necessarily have the greatest sustainability model in terms of, how do the people that maintain the software, how do they get paid, how do they feed themselves, all those sort of things. But that's kind of a different part of the conversation. But as a whole, open source software has been tremendously successful at really reshaping how we use technology, and it's impacted every part of our lives, from how we live to how we work to how we play to how we collaborate and communicate and all the things in between. That's not necessarily the part of this I want to focus on today. What I want to focus on today is really, we're kind of at an inflection point as we get to at various stages in our industry. We've seen open source be tremendously successful. The CNCF, which is the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, has been around for almost 10 years now, maybe just a little less than that. We know that because we just recently marked the 10-year anniversary of Kubernetes. And out of that community, out of that forum, if you will, out of that foundation, a lot of open source has been brought to market, right? CNCF doesn't create the technologies; other people create the technologies, and they use the foundation as a governance model, as a marketing engine, all those sorts of things. As we sort of not wind down the sort of cloud 1.0 era, but we sort of, it's become mainstream. It's become something that is sort of under the foundation underneath the next generation of things. Again, whether that's AI or something else that comes along right now, it seems to be AI. It's sometimes worth looking at, what made it successful, and are there things that we can look at from there that help us determine what success looks like in the next wave, the next 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, whatever it might be. And most of the things, within the CNCF, in fact, I guess I would argue all the things in the CNCF are based on open source. That's sort of, required to get into the CNCF. But most of the things that people tend to think about today that power a lot of what they do, whether it's, them building things themselves in terms of cloud and applications and so forth, or whether it's the SaaS services that they're consuming, or whether it's, things out of the public cloud, so much of it is based on open source. So it has been an innovation engine, no doubt, hands down. It's been a tremendous innovation engine. The flip side of it is sort of this lingering thing that is always talked about and seems to be, always kind of confused or confusing. And, there's really kind of no definitive answer to it. I don't know that I have a definitive answer today, but I kind of want to lay out a framework for thinking about how do people make money, whether it's companies, individuals, communities, whatever. How do you go about making money using the technology of open source? And I only frame it like this because, for decades now, our technology industry, which does tremendously well, it funds lots and lots of people, your grandparents, your parents, your neighbors, have technology companies in their, savings portfolio, their 401k, their retirement portfolios. So technology plays a huge role in our economy. And so we oftentimes think about technology in terms of does it make money, right? Does it make enough money to continue to sustain itself? Does it make enough money to continue to invest in innovation for the next things that are coming along? Does it, create enough money to be able to sustain the people that are working on it, whether they are building the technology, selling, marketing, integrating the technology? So, there are some times when it's an awkward conversation to, have the words open source and sort of money or finances in the same breath. But for the most part, people, across the industry, other than the most diehard sort of free open source people, the conversation of revenues and profitability and money and earnings and all those sort of things is not unusual, because we tend to think about that from a technology perspective. So I thought it would be interesting, and I don't remember that we've ever really done this. We've sort of talked about, the open source business model and all these sorts of things, but we've never really talked about, like, what does the profile look like of projects that have gone on to eventually be the foundation of something successful with open source, right? So what I want to try and do is lay that out to a certain extent, and keep in mind, it's an interesting thing in our industry. There was a company called Red Hat, who was probably one of the first to really monetize open source, turn it into a business that could be monetized, that could become fairly large. They obviously went IPO, became a public company at some point in time back in the late 90s. And since then, a lot of people have said, okay, if you're in the open source business, if the foundation of what you do is open source, does your business look like Red Hat's? And, there's been lots of papers written, and I'll put some links in the show notes, to people who've said, well, Red Hat was a complete anomaly. What they do, how they do their, what they do in terms of going to market, how they do it, can never be replicated, right? They were kind of a fluke of time that, they hit at the right time with Linux. And again, people can debate whether that statement is true. I know VCs say it all the time. And so I want to kind of think about, is it possible that not the Red Hat model is the right model? People can argue whether that model is correct or not. It has its success is visible and transparent to the market, or you can see how much revenue they've made and how long they've been in business. But to look at the types of projects and the way that companies address those projects or communities address those projects, and are there any patterns that are more successful or less successful than others, right? So that's the framing I want to use today. So I looked at this and I was like, okay, which projects can you point to that you can then sort of upstream of that say, okay, there is a healthy community around that, or there is a company that is, highly profitable, and, what are the characteristics that made those things possible? So this is the stuff I sort of had on my list in my notes. If we look at things like, wide usage infrastructure projects, so things like Linux, things like Kubernetes, you could argue, in different ways, something like OpenStack, but these are wide usage infrastructure projects, right? There are things that are foundational for something above them in the OSI stack. So if you are the operating system, it is applications. If you are something like Kubernetes, it's sort of another abstraction in which applications live on top of you, but you are essentially wide usage infrastructure. Some people might call them a platform. And if we think about those, they have wide support in terms of the number of companies, the number of individuals that contribute to those projects. So they are by no means an individual company project. They are very important to a lot of different people in that they have horizontal use cases. They can be used across any industry, really. They can be used across lots of different kinds of hardware. They support, all sorts of different programming models and languages and so forth. And so what we've seen is that characteristic tends to be something that you can, number one, see a lot of different contributors, a diversity of contributors involved with the project. That means that the opportunity for somebody to figure out how to monetize it in different ways. It could be entirely support. It could be a commercial product. It could be a cloud service. It could be an SI driven integration project. Those things tend to be, they have proven to have the characteristics of things that have gone on to become monetarily viable, right? And those are just a couple of examples of them. A couple of others that we've seen, critical security. We've seen some of those. Security teams tend to be people who are looking for not only great technology, but also a level of trust with the people that they're working with. Also a sort of trusted supply chain in terms of when problems happen, how do they get resolved and what's the time frame for that. So we have seen projects like Vault, so HashiCorp's Vault, kind of fit into that category as something that has become commercially viable. We've seen complex data services, so things like a MongoDB or a Kafka, maybe something like a SQL database. We've seen those things be able to be commercially viable because they, the importance of them is, when they have a bad day, the company tends to have a bad day. If your database breaks, if your database, is at the core of what you do, you need to make sure that's going to be stable, scalable, highly available, highly redundant, and all those sorts of things. And so we've seen people build commercial viability around complex data services. Now, then there are some other categories of stuff that we haven't necessarily seen people be able to make commercial viability for, right? One of them being programming languages, right? Not a lot of, there are some companies who will support, that's all they do is support, languages, but we don't tend to see, huge revenues from those. I think a lot of that's because, the communities tend to support them fairly well. People don't necessarily make big changes to them all the time. And developers as a whole don't tend to necessarily hold all their own budget for things, right? So, programming languages have not proven to be something that are commercially viable for the most part, right? We see people charging now a little bit for Java and some other things, but for the most part, programming languages don't tend to make a lot of money. Things like management tools, observability, and so forth. We don't tend to necessarily see really big companies with this. It's not something that companies feel like they are willing to pay a lot of money for. They're willing to pay some. We've obviously seen companies, in the observability space who, have done very, very well. Oftentimes, like Splunk or Datadog or others, their business model tends to be less about, kind of the open sourceness of what they do. In fact, neither one of those are necessarily considered open source. I think they probably have open source under the covers, but really their secret sauce is proprietary stuff. It's the engines that are able to ingest lots of data, be able to manage it well, and then be able to reason over it in ways that, give you interesting insights. So the open source piece in the management observability space really hasn't been something that has necessarily been, monetizable and so forth. And then we kind of get into, what are the other things that people do to make them commercially viable, right? Like, so, in the example of something like Linux, Red Hat can't be commercially viable by just taking the Linux kernel and, slapping a logo on it and, kind of copying the documentation and saying, here, pay me a premium. They have to do things above and beyond that, right? So this is where you start to get into, how does open source kind of become viable? Well, the first way is people tend to do support, right? Support tends to be the low-hanging fruit. There is some money to be made for support. Now, support gets into a very interesting kind of thing because if you are just simply, providing support, you are a Slack channel, an email address, a phone number that you can call. For something that just works, you're probably not going to make a whole lot of money because people don't have a reason to necessarily reach out to you if the product just works. They don't need help, right? They don't need, if there is, already a mailing group or some other types of thing that helps when things are there, they don't need a lot of support. Now, where the support piece becomes viable is based on the complexity of the project. So as the project itself is more complicated, right? So think of it this way. If the open source project is incredibly good by itself, you can just take it, you can just download it, you can just install it, and it just works, and it rarely breaks, and it rarely needs things to be fixed, right? As opposed to just sort of like you add on some things. Those projects tend to have a really hard time becoming commercialized because if your foundational thing for making money in open source, which oftentimes is support, isn't really needed, nothing else really is going to differentiate it, at least as long as the project and the thing that you're trying to commercialize are the same bits, right? So that tends to be the first thing. Is the more complex the project is and the more difficult it is for the project to ultimately kind of get working, the better chance you have to commercialize your support of it. Now, the hope is that the thing that the project does is really valuable to people. So once you get past the complexity of getting it working, installing it, maintaining it, all that kind of stuff, if the value of it beyond that is really useful, then people have proven to make that commercialized, right? And we've seen that like with Linux, we've seen that with Kubernetes, we've seen that with databases, and we've seen that with things like Kafka and other stuff, where the value of the thing, once you get past the complexity, is valuable enough to create a commercial entity that can be successful, right? If the thing that you're building is complex in terms of needing lots of integrations, this is where we oftentimes see, systems integrators and third-party kind of value-added resellers and so forth able to take that and make sense of it. And to a certain extent, that's a variation on kind of support. It's just support through integration as opposed to support through break fix. Now, the second way that people tend to sort of find success with open source is to take the same thing but turn it into a cloud service, right? So the thing that you are adding value around is the operation of it themselves. And this is what the cloud providers have done really, really well. A lot of the projects that are run by a single company oftentimes do this really well. So, the MongoDB cloud, or, the Atlas cloud, or the Confluent cloud, or others that we've had on the show before, and you can go back and find those in our archives. They essentially are saying this is a complex product, and honestly, the odds of you getting it right through support or better documentation are less good than us, who are the experts running this thing. So let's turn it into essentially a cloud service that you can consume the things that you want to consume out of it. And we're going to hide the complexity for you, right? So essentially you're paying for us to hide the complexity, and you're paying for us to hide the ongoing maintenance and all those sorts of things. And so that's another way that we've seen, especially this sort of single company open source projects. Again, I talked about like Kafka and Confluent and MongoDB, and HashiCorp has tried to do this with some things with Vault and Terraform. We've seen Red Hat try and do this. We've seen Docker hasn't necessarily tried to do this, but some of the companies that you would think of in the open source space are moving towards more of a model in which they turn them into cloud services, and that's another way that we see that. So oftentimes when you're looking at the single vendor projects, a Docker or something just comes to mind where you're like, look, it's mostly driven by one company. HashiCorp's another one in which they're primarily the contributor to it. Those tend to struggle unless they turn themselves into in terms of commercializing, unless they turn themselves into a cloud service, and this is where we've seen all the kind of kerfuffle lately, and the kind of problems that the open source community has, is they eventually say, well, other people are able to just freely distribute and use this as well, and kind of following normal open source models, in which they go and they sort of change the licensing such that essentially they turn it into proprietary software to a certain extent, right? Like if other people can't use it and modify the software and redistribute the software, essentially what you have is no longer really kind of an open source project. You have some sort of open core variant, or some sort of restricted license thing. And at that point, you're really just, in terms of kind of black and white, you're really more proprietary software than you are open source software. So, and that's not a terrible thing, right? If it's a difficult thing when licenses get changed, because people have a tendency to go, oh, you pulled the rug out from under me. But at the same time, oftentimes when you have gone down the path of really kind of being a single vendor driven open source project, you can't maintain the project at scale. You don't have the revenues or the people or the inputs to, the resources to maintain it at scale. And so oftentimes you have to move it to something in which you monetize more of the user base than you did before. And again, I probably should have covered this kind of up front, right? The successful projects, and successful again in this context, people that have figured out how to monetize it, in any other context, you would say none of them are successful projects, right? Because the reality is, I'll just use Red Hat as an example. Red Hat has been very successful at monetizing Linux in the enterprise, Fortune 500 types of companies and so forth. But if you look at the bigger usage of Linux market, if you look at the entire Linux market, Red Hat probably has 10%, 15% of that market share, if that number. The number of people that don't use Red Hat Enterprise Linux, but in most cases don't even pay for Linux, is 80, 90% of the market, right? So when we talk about success, and you could argue the same thing in Kubernetes, and you could argue the same thing in lots of different things, in which there are multiple options in the market, or even single options in the market, most people don't pay for the open source software. So for the most part, if you were to measure it on, is 10% market share or 10% market adoption successful? For most businesses, you would say no, right? You would say no. If you don't have 30 or 40% market share, really, you're not terribly successful. If we were grading this, like as a in a school teacher category, like if you got 90% of it wrong, you failed, right? So I should have mentioned that early on, right? Like the success of open source is in the context of non-traditional kind of business success. Red Hat having X amount of revenue, or MongoDB having X amount of revenue, or MariaDB, Maria having X amount of revenue, or whoever it might be, Docker having X amount of revenue. For the most part, yes, they are successful as businesses because they have figured out how to make more money than they spend, and be profitable over time, right? Not all of them are even at that rate level yet. But from a normal business perspective, if you were to say, hey, are you successful if you have 10% of the market and the other 90% doesn't pay for your product? By most business characteristics, you would typically say, no, that's not terribly successful, right? And this is where, this is why you see so many companies, or you're beginning to see more companies say, look, I have to acknowledge that I used open source at the beginning of my life cycle as a marketing vehicle in order to reduce my marketing costs, to gain market adoption, to gain user adoption, to gain user feedback. And that was the only sustainable way that I could go about building a company, is if my marketing costs were very low comparative to if I was entirely proprietary and there was no way for you to experience the product or do whatever, which the marketing costs would be very, very high. And this is what we see in SaaS businesses and other things. So, I think there are some characteristics, as I mentioned, of what successful looks like. It's often wide infrastructure usage, it's complex projects, it's critical security, it's complex data services. We have seen all of those types of things, prove to be successful in open source. The less complex you are, the more you're driven by a single vendor, the more that you are in the domain of kind of like programmers who don't tend to have budget versus infrastructure people who are responsible for, like our, uptime and things like that, RTO, RPO, all those types of things, SLAs. That tends to be more where people will put money. And then the question really becomes, can you build a business model around either support or things above and beyond support that that you can monetize at big levels. And this is where open source gets complicated, because so many of these companies figure out how to take a lot of money. Again, a lot of that money gets turned back into marketing dollars for kind of giving it away, those types of things. So open source at the end of the day does have some characteristics that you can turn into monetizable businesses. It doesn't necessarily look like sort of traditional things you would learn in business school. It doesn't necessarily have the metrics that most business schools would look at, businesses and say these are wildly successful. But the more you can make your business that's based on open source look like commercial software in terms of very high margins, 80, 90% gross margins, 100% gross margins. And if you can do it in ways in which you can leverage the community to, be offsetting some of your engineering costs, your support costs, those types of things, or even your marketing costs, then you have an opportunity to commercially make something viable. But it is a complex space. It does not look like sort of business 101 level stuff. But it is interesting to sort of watch the number of new companies that come along that maybe don't seem to have kind of learned the lessons of the past of, what makes a project successful? Is it the number of contributors? How much control do you have over the project? And then what are the different mechanisms you have in terms of trying to monetize it, whether it's support, whether it's turning it into a cloud service, whether it's something that they call open core, in which, part of the software continues to remain open, but part of it gets held back. And some people would argue that's not really open source anymore. Again, that's really semantics. Or do you, eventually just have to change the license and turn into something that looks more proprietary? And all of those things are in the spectrum of possibilities. And, there are all sorts of feedback from the community, positive and negative, that are going to go along with those decisions, right? There's not necessarily one that's right versus wrong. But I think we have, over the last decade, sort of seen the options that are out there. I think there are people who learn from history and do very well. There are others who have not learned anything from history and continue to keep trying to do the same thing over and over again. And so, I just kind of wanted to throw this out there as we get into the next sort of phase of cloud and the early phases of AI, as we see companies try and do things with the open source. Are they following any of the known models, or, are they going to come up with something that's completely new that none of us expected? And I'm excited to see if that emerges. Don't necessarily know what that will be, but excited to see how that emerges. So anyways, with that, I'll wrap it up. Thank you all for listening. Hope you all have had a great first half of 2024 as we jump into the second half of 2024. I know that means, partially for some of you, it just means, hey, the next month or so, I'm going to worry about, being outside and going to the pool and doing vacations and stuff. Some of you, it means, hey, you're halfway through the summer and your kids are going to get ready to go back to school and those types of things. For the others, that it might mean, hey, it's the time of year when your business starts planning for what next year looks like, and all the fun planning meetings that go along with it. So, anyways, whatever you're working on, hope it's going well. Thank you all for listening. Thanks for telling a friend about the show. Thanks for helping us grow the community. And again, if you ever have any questions or things that we can help you with, show@thecloudcast.net is the best way to reach us, or reach us on LinkedIn or Facebook or Twitter or any of the other social medias that are out there. You can find us. Links are in the feedback section at the bottom of the show notes. So with that, thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.